political system of where the checks and balances aren't the judiciary, the executive, and the Congress, but the checks and balances are blackmail. And I think that would have blown up too. So in Washington, D.C., you had the Department of Justice covering up, but you had the Secret Service doing all the dirty work. I mean, in my book, I give accounts of the Secret Service breaking down someone's door and, like, holding a gun to their head. Just the same kind of intimidation tactics. And in Nebraska, there was a perpetrator, a pedophile, who was a multimillionaire who didn't want to do time, and he saw that the Senate subcommittee's investigation was picking up momentum, and he reached out to the Senate subcommittee to make a deal. And I've got a affidavit from a Nebraska state senator that says that the FBI threatened to kill this pedophile, this perpetrator, if he talked. So you've got the Department of Justice, you've got the Secret Service, and you've got the FBI really putting in a full court press to keep this whole thing completely covered up. And you've got the media assisting it, too. I mean, you've got CBS doing a hatchet job on Alicia Owen and the Senate subcommittee. You've got the New York Times generally through omission. The New York Times jumped on this story immediately, right, when social services personnel came forward and started talking to the senators. I mean, the New York Times wrote a couple of articles about it. But then they didn't report about it until after this really corrupt grand jury said they laid off all reporting on the story until this corrupt grand jury said that the abuse allegations were a carefully crafted hoax. Mm-hmm. And the Washington Times was working very hard to show that Craig Spence was engaged in illicit activities and was also blackmailing people.
And that's very unusual in itself, because the Washington Times, owned by Reverend Moon, has been a reliable defender of Republican interests, with just a handful of exceptions.
Yes, it was the reporter, Paul Rodriguez, who spearheaded the Washington Times reporting on Craig Spence's blackmail activity, his connections to the CIA, his connections to various powerful people, his drug activity. Paul Rodriguez was an amazing journalist, and they were actually nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting on this. But the Washington Post just steamrolled over all their reporting. I mean, completely steamrolled over it. And the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times jumped on the back of the Washington Post as they steamrolled the Washington Times reporting on this. So it's kind of interesting. But one of the people that come up as potentially compromised is a high flyer at the Washington Post. And I talk about that in the book. So it's possible that you could have had a very high-ranking Washington Post official who was compromised by this by this blackmail operation.
Nick, the things that we've discussed so far, which are an interstate pedophilia ring, of all kinds of sexual activities, including some pretty perverse ones, the use of underage children as prostitutes, and the pandering that occurred there, that's all very sordid, very dark. But the most difficult parts of your book relate to satanic rituals and incidents in which these children who were being used and abused sexually were witnesses to the murder of babies and other children in their presence. Talk a little bit about these sadistic, and language fails me here to describe what was going on at these events.
Well, there's definitely some horrific stories that are told by these kids, and two of the kids do discuss watching other kids being murdered, and a couple of kids discuss other kids being sold. So, and then Henry Vinson, who ran the escort service in Washington, D.C., who says that King and Spence let him in on all their secrets, said that King had told him that they offered that service, that you could kill a kid if you wanted. And Henry Vinson just found that to be probably the most bizarre thing he'd ever heard in his life. I mean, he was just completely shocked and appalled by that. So there is some evidence that you could you could do whatever you wanted to some of these kids, that they were truly throwaway kids. I mean, all the kids described, or almost all the kids that I talked to described extremely sadistic pedophilic abuse, And I guess that there were pedophiles that like to take it even further than just outright sadism of cutting the kids or burning the kids. That they, according to some of the kids, that they had witnessed actual murders. And I do bring in studies at the end of the book, in the epilogue, about ritual abuse, because a lot of ritual abuse has been debunked, and I really understand that. I mean, I remember the satanic panic of the 1980s or early 1990s, and so I was very skeptical of that element. But I also bring in another investigation by the U.S. Customs Service on a cult called the Finders that was seemingly trafficking children, that were doing some very sadistic things to children. And I start the book with that because I've got a U.S. Customs report that shows that this cult called the Finders was trafficking kids, and they got busted in Tallahassee, Florida. And the Tallahassee Police Department found child pornography in the van, and they contacted the U.S. Customs Service, which has a child pornography unit. And then the D.C. police got involved because of they had an informant that said that the Finders were involved in a murder and also, quote-unquote, blood rituals with children. So, and then the FBI got involved, and there was a search, and the Finders were obviously off into some weird occult tangents. And there was the U.S. Customs and the D.C. Police Department served a search warrant on the Finders. And ultimately, they found child pornography. They found that the Finders were buying children. There was documentation about the Finders buying children and kidnapping children. It's a really horrific document. And that's what got me started on Franklin. Mm-hmm. At the end of the U.S. Customs report, it says that the CIA has quashed all investigations into the activities of the Finders, and there'll be no more investigation. So the 6 kids that were with the 2 Finders in Tallahassee that were put into protective custody were repatriated with the cult, and then the 2 cult members were actually who were being charged with multiple counts of child abuse. And someone in social services in Florida said that one of the children definitely showed signs of sexual abuse. But they were let out of jail without, and all their charges of child abuse were dropped. I lead off with that document because that gets into some of the extremely sadistic and very strange pedophilic abuse that is part of Franklin. But that is a U.S. Customs report, and it also shows that the CIA quashed that investigation too. Mm-hmm. So because in Franklin, although you've got the Department of Justice and the FBI and the Secret Service covering it up, I mean, the CIA is always on the periphery of this story. I mean, the CIA is not very far. And I make a pretty strong case that the CIA might have been the prime mover in this, in the Franklin pedophile network.
Nick, there's much in the book, and it's a powerful very difficult set of issues to explore, but I think it's very important. I think people need to understand the extent to which our criminal justice system can be compromised and has been. In closing, could you just briefly tell our listeners about the connection to Boys Town?
Well, that was one of the hardest aspects of this book, is that Boys Town kids were involved. And I'd always looked upon Boys Town as a utopia for troubled youth. And the investigator, Gary Caradori, he was the state investigator who found 4 of the kids that came forward. And then a couple of the other kids also came forward. 4 of the initial kids that came forward said that Boys Town kids were involved, and Gary Caradori had a leads list of like 60 victims, which I ultimately worked off of. It was sealed with the grand jury documentation. And I looked for the Boys Town kids that were on the leads list, and I found 3 of them. And all 3 of them corroborated that they had either been molested by Larry King or they knew of Larry King pandering Boys Town kids, and a couple had even confessed to me that they had been pandered by Lawrence King and actually flown around the country. So, unfortunately, you have the Catholic Church involved in the scandal, too, vis-a-vis Boys Town. And so between Franklin is really kind of mind-boggling in the respect that you have the law enforcement corrupted to cover up child abuse. You have the media corrupted to cover up child abuse. And then you've got involvement of the Catholic Church. You've got the media, the church, and the state all involved in child abuse.
It is stunning and deeply shocking, but it's very well documented, and I commend you on an excellent job of researching and reporting a very complex set of issues, very dark, and certainly things that are very hard for you to forget and let go of. Nick Bryant, thank you for joining us today. This powerful book is called The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal. It's out in hardcover from Trine Day. Nick Bryant, good to talk to you.
Thank you, Peter.